Hello.
Hello.
Hello, Professor. Please, Shubham, please go live in Facebook.
Okay. Okay. Would you like me to begin? Hello. Would you like me to begin?
Yes, please. Let's go for the formalities first. Can you hear me, Professor Matthews?
Yes, I can.
Yes. So, dear Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, this is Rudra Narayan Das. It's a true pleasure for me to welcome you to this World Human Sciences Management Conference 2021, organized by Center for ADIVASI Research and Development, Odisha, in association with Indian Institute of Management, Sambalpur, and Central University of Odisha, Koraput. The broader theme of this conference is AGNOTOLOGICAL context, disciplinary practices of social sciences, and policy frames. On behalf of CARD, I extend my heartfelt thanks and gratitude to Professor Mahadev Jaiswal, Director, Indian Institute of Management, and late Professor I. Ramabrahmam, former Vice Chancellor, Central University of Odisha, and Professor S.K. Palito, Dean Biodiversity, Central University of Odisha, and the Acting Vice Chancellor of Central University of Odisha. The convener of this August conference is eminent historian from NIT Vadodara, Gujarat, Professor Chandi Prasad Nanda, and eminent policy activist, writer, and philanthropist, Mr. Charudar Panigrahi. Friends, this evening is going to be very mesmerizing and thought-provoking for all of us, because we have with us Professor Matthew McManus. Professor Matthew's interest in politics was sparked at a young age when he was involved with Amnesty International and other human rights campaigns at his high school. He completed his bachelor's in public affairs and policy management at Carleton University in 2010, developing a more pronounced interest in theory alongside practical politics. His LLM thesis at the National University of Ireland focused on the philosophical justification of law. After receiving a Chancellor Bennett Scholarship, Professor McManus moved to Toronto to complete his Ph.D. in Socio-Legal Studies at York University. His work there focused on developing a theory of human dignity and rights, along with more down-to-earth empirical research on cyberbullying and the democratic participation of marginalized communities. After graduating with the PhD in 2017, Professor McManus completed his postdoctoral research on the family law problems in low-income families before completing a brief stint as an analyst with the Committee of International Justice and Accountability that same summer. He then spent 2 years as a professor of politics and international relations at Tec Monetary in Mexico City, where he published 4 books and several journal articles. This includes the rise of postmodern conservatism and making human dignity central to international human rights law. His forthcoming work includes the monograph Liberalism and Liberal Rights, a critical legal argument, and serving as editor of the essay collection Liberalism and Socialism, embittered keen of moral enemies. In 2020, he joined as a faculty of politics in Whitman College, Walla, in Washington, D.C. So, Professor Matthews, we kind-heartedly welcome you to the World Human Sciences and Management Conference organized by Center for ADIVASI Research and Development. Please continue to your talk. Over to you, Professor Matthews.
Okay, thank you very much. I really appreciate you inviting me here. And thank you very much also for the kind introduction, more than I deserve, certainly. So my plan for right now is to speak for about 15, maybe 20 minutes on my subject matter, which primarily pertains to the first book that I published, The Rise of Postmodern Conservatism, as well as the essay collection that I released a year later or so, What is Postmodern Conservatism? Talking specifically about its relationship to various concerns about identity in the contemporary era. After that, I'm happy to take as many questions as people might happen to have, because I find that the Q&A section of any of these is really the most interesting part. And it's also where some of the most creative thoughts really come to the fore, certainly a lot more than just the monologuing about something that I've written before. And it's more exciting for all of you as well, I'm sure. So one of the things that we need to understand before I begin to dive into this is this concept of postmodernity, which is central to my work on postmodern conservatism. Who here, anyone want to raise their hand, has heard this term before, postmodern? Either, live or? No one's heard the term postmodern before? No. Okay, that's fair enough. So there are a lot of different ways that postmodernism has been framed. And my voice is really just one in a giant chorus. Some people interpret postmodernism as effectively a kind of skeptical philosophy that originally developed in French universities in particular, and then kind of spread through much of the Western world through literary arts programs, English studies programs, you name it, right? Another way that postmodernism has been understood is as a kind of aesthetic movement. Primarily influencing various architects, writers, painters, you name it. If any of you know the well-known American author Thomas Pynchon, author of Gravity's Rainbow, he's kind of an emblematic postmodern author. Or you can think of TV shows like Seinfeld or The Simpsons, or even the Avengers films that are very popular right now as kind of emblematic of a postmodern aesthetic form with their pastiche-like approach to portraying mythological content, and their kind of ironic sensibility about themselves as aesthetic productions, right? But the way that I tend to understand postmodernism, in line with people like David Harvey or Frederick Jameson, is as a cultural condition, where defined by what Jean-François Lyotard called declining faith in grand, so-called, or meta-narratives. And I'll get into what that means in a few seconds. But, more importantly, for my purposes, one of the things that I argue is emblematic of postmodernity is a declining sense of where our identity comes from, or if you want to use more technical language, the corrosion of many of the traditional, quote, sources of the self that individuals rely upon to determine who they think they are and what community, for example, they belong on. And many of the sources of the self that have corroded came from comparatively stable traditions and practices that have been liquidated by many of the processes that we now associate with modernization. So there are a lot of different modernization processes that are responsible for the corrosion of traditional sources of the self. We can think about the influx of capital and the spread of neoliberalization around the globe. We can think about the advent of a new cosmopolitan order in international law starting in the 1940s. That's now kind of expanded to cover many elements of the economic realm with the spread of things like international trade law, more liberal immigration laws. We can also think about things like the advent of cultural pluralism in many parts of the world where there was once a much more solidaristic or homogenous sense of national identity. But just to give one example that I foreground in the book, urbanization can be seen as emblematic of modernization, and we can understand how it relates to the postmodern dissolution of the self, or the sources of the self, excuse me. So for instance, just to use an American example, in the early 20th century, about 60% of the American population lived in rural areas. And this was widely true in many countries. You can think about the United Kingdom, Canada, Germany, France, or China increasingly. So in the 1950s, about 80% of the Chinese population, I believe, was primarily located in rural areas. And that number is increasingly inverting as China modernizes and becomes an increasingly hegemonic regional power. And what we see again, not only is this inversion, where an increasing number of people live in cities, but also a pluralization of the population as millions of migrants and their families enter into new nation states in order to meet the demands of capital for labor, bringing with them a variety of different cultural practices, belief, convictions, and this dramatically changes life for many people. I think in a very positive way in many circumstances, since it exposes people to a wide variety of different possibilities in life that they might otherwise have been largely ignorant of. But of course, it also generates a very visceral and considerable backlash. In the United States, for instance, you can think about the resentment towards New York values, which Ted Cruz, who was a conservative politician in the United States, articulated in 2016. And you can also see examples of very similar kinds of resentments contemporaneously with the rise of the BJP in India, where particularly in urban spaces, but also in the countryside, which is quite distinct from the American example, there's widespread resentment of Muslims, particularly Islamic refugees who are seen as infiltrating the country. This is a quote from Amit Shah in April 2019, where he gave a now infamous speech saying, "Infiltrators are like termites in the soil of Bengal." I've never been able to pronounce this right. The BJP government will pick up the infiltrators one by one and throw them into the Bay of Bengal. Pardon me, I'm sorry, my Hindi is non-existent. So the corrosion of the typical sources of the self and the traditional practices and interactions which enabled the development of a thick sense of selfhood, which came from residing in places like rural areas, which came from engaging in traditional religious practices, which came from being very embedded in conservative traditionalist practices, and exposure to higher levels of pluralism, higher levels of labor instability, higher levels of liberalization, in effect, on how people thought of themselves and how they conceived of their sense of identity. And I argue in all my books that in some respects, this is a very positive development because what you see when a sense of selfhood is destabilized is a kind of openness to new possibilities and the inclusion of different kinds of groups that may have been excluded historically, right? And we can see this in many countries where the destabilization of conservative traditions, particularly conservative religious traditions, open the door to more liberal notions of equality becoming increasingly popular. So for instance, you could think about religious mores regarding, the kind of ugliness or taboo nature of LGBTQ rights disappearing as the postmodern epoch becomes increasingly ascendant. Our sense of ourselves, of many people's self as kind of religiously oriented declines. And this marginalized group has an political opportunity to kind of demand rights for itself that it wasn't able to before. Or you can also think about the kind of patriarchal expectations about women's role in the family and society that also declined as many of the historical convictions we had about the role women were supposed to play in the family declined, opening the space for things like second wave and third wave feminism to mobilize and kind of demand reforms in a much more egalitarian and feminist direction. So I point this out to say that I'm by no means critical of all elements of modernization or even of postmodernity, since I think many of them have a very positive connotation. On the other hand, not having a clearly defined sense of identity prompted tremendous anxiety in many people, as you might imagine, right? For many of us, understanding who we are, both individually and collectively, is kind of a fundamental existential yearning that's been spoken about quite eloquently by everything from theologians to writers to poets, you name it, right? And some of the people who were most anxious about the decline of sources of the self, indeed, were vulnerable people, particularly those in industrial work areas whose real wages have stagnated for a long time. There was a sense on the part of many of these groups that their communities were faltering, and to use a famous sociological perspective, other people, particularly migrants, immigrants, and refugees, were cutting in line So there was this idea that with liberalization and neoliberalization, these people who were in precarious work conditions, who once occupied positions of comparative esteem, they were now being undercut as their government was bringing in cheap labor from the developing world or migrants for refugee purposes. And these people were taking benefits that should have belonged to them and which they desperately need. But my argument is that this was actually an anomaly. Since we look at the kind of demographic makeup, most of the supporters of many of the populist conservative movements that emerged starting in 2010, and we can see this being the case in places like Brazil, we can see it in the case of the United States, we can also see it in the case of Hungary. The Indian context is a little bit more complicated, but there are many parallels as well. Oftentimes, it wasn't resentment on the part of workers or marginalized people who were concerned about social decay in this way. It was a resentment of the powerful or historically powerful groups in society towards the weak, towards those who they felt were gaining increasing power at their expense and felt entitled to preserve these systems of power that had benefited from them for a long time. So for instance, a very common narrative you saw postmodern conservatives make was the belief that, quote, our country and our identity was being taken away by the presence of undesirable or foreign elements. And this was all being abetted, of course, by the presence of progressive or leftist or liberal movements that did their best to try to demand inclusion for these, quote, undesirable or foreign elements, right? And oftentimes what you saw was postmodern conservatives framing the presence of these groups that they considered to be foreign or not belonging here. This was associated with narratives of decline or decadence and fall on the part of the nation or the religious group or whatever it happens to be. And oftentimes these political movements for populist postmodern conservatism rose promising to kind of restore the people to greatness or restore the proper group to its venerable place in society. This is a good quote by an American conservative called Dinesh D'Souza. Some of you might have heard of him. He's kind of a conspiracy theorist, and he actually went to jail for campaign fraud not too long ago. But there's this book from 2007, The Enemy at Home, where he says, in this book, I make the claim that will seem startling at the outset. The cultural left in this country is responsible for causing 9/11. That's the 9/11 terrorist attacks. In faulting the cultural left, I am not making the absurd accusation that this group blew up the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. I'm saying that the cultural left and its allies in Congress, the media, Hollywood, the nonprofit sector, and the universities are the primary cause of the volcano of anger towards America that is erupting from the so-called Islamic world. The Muslims who carried out the 9/11 attacks were the products of this visceral rage, some of it based on legitimate concerns, some of it based on wrongful prejudice, but all of it fueled and encouraged by the cultural left. Thus, without the cultural left, 9/11 would not have happened. And this is, of course, a remarkable kind of statement, both in terms of its causal implications and in terms of its animosity and partisanship. But it does really kind of encapsulate this conservative anxiety about how it is that culturally leftist or progressive movements are leading to this national decline because they're betting decadence, kind of lack of militaristic readiness, and of course, a sense of permissiveness. That's the biggest problem, right? They're allowing too many people who don't belong in our society to come in, or they're allowing people who should have known their place to have too much power, and they're getting kind of uppity about things. So the way postmodern conservatives solve this is to try to recreate a sense of identity by drawing upon hyper-real reactionary sources that promise a renewed sense of stability and order. So they kind of grasp on to sources of selfhood, many of which aren't really conceived of very accurately in historical terms, but all of which kind of offer this emotional stability in what they see as being a world that's increasingly unmoored and unmoored because it's under attack by progressive and liberal forces. So the sources of identity that are typically drawn upon by postmodern conservatives include ethnicity, religion, masculinity, very popular one, masculinity, actually. In some parts of the world, straightness, this idea of being a heterosexual male or heterosexual female, who kind of is wary of the changes that are going on in a way we conceive gender identity. And in its kind of most virulent forms, you can also see race being very appealing. And the narrative typically runs that whatever identity the postmodern conservative associates with was once upon a time, and this goes back to what I was saying earlier, in a dominant position in society. Once upon a time, we were the people in charge. That's when the country or the group was at its best. And now, because we are not in charge, or because our power is being gradually undermined, we can now see how the country or how the nation state or whatever it happens to be, or our religious group is declining. It's falling apart in the way that, for instance, Nestor Souza would suggest. The country was falling apart before 9/11, right? And the reason why the country is falling apart is, again, primarily there's a foreign element. The narrative runs that there's a foreign element or an element of society that does not belong. It is advocating for more power in society, and it's being abetted or aided by progressive allies, the so-called enemy within. And what happens typically with postmodern conservatives is they turn to strongmen. And I think it's important to note that ubiquitously, almost ubiquitously, with the exception of France, most of the kind of postmodern conservative politicians that have risen to the fore, whether we think of Jair Bolsonaro or Modi or Viktor Orban in Hungary or Donald Trump, of course, they've been men. Again, the only exception I could think of is Marine Le Pen in France. Once upon a time of the Front National, right? And what these strongmen do is they promise to eliminate the kind of progressive enemies within, expunge the foreign or undeserving or unwanted element from society, and consequently restore the country and the group that should be at the head of the country to greatness, right? So postmodern conservatism has an interesting way, it's worth noting, of conceiving deservingness or desert or merit. And this is what I'm going to end with, right? And one of the things that's interesting about it is how closely it maps on to other conservative movements historically, right? So conservatism emerged, modern conservatism, I should say, in the 18th century as a response to various different egalitarian movements. First, in countries like Haiti and France and the United States. And its kind of fundamental outlook is the idea that there are some people in society who are more deserving of a certain high status and are more equipped to exercise power than the mass of people, right? And postmodern conservatism is a kind of conservatism because it holds to this sensibility, right? This idea that there are some people who are better than others, or at least more worthy than others, and they should be the one in charge. And the threat to the country, of course, is that the undeserving or the unwanted or the foreign are now getting too much power, which of course is what contributes to this triumph. So probably the most famous example of postmodern conservatism is Donald Trump. So it's the example that I foreground in my book, but we can talk about others. So for instance, Trumpist conceptions of desert and merit owe a lot to the era of neoliberal competitiveness in the 1980s, out of which Trump himself emerged. And I'm sure many of you who are familiar with Donald Trump will recognize, kind of his language of merit and desert pretty quickly, right? You can think about, his constant comment about how it is that America has now become a nation of losers, how it's constantly being taken advantage of, and how he promised to make them winners again, right? He was going to show the rest of the world who was boss. Didn't actually work out that way. But, this kind of conception of merit and a division of the world into winners and losers and those who were taken advantage of and those who took advantage of others was very, very important, right? And one of the things that is emblematic of postmodern conservatives is they tend to actually ironically see themselves as being, once upon a time, figures who are in a dominant position in society, but again, who are increasingly threatened by leftist or liberal movements. And they consequently tend to conceive of the state, international institutions, international law, it's worth noting, is something that a lot of postmodern conservatives attack, unless it's international trade law, and the cultural left as playing a role in allowing the undeserving or the unworthy to cut ahead of sincere winners, right? And this echoes, again, longstanding conservative reactionary concerns about how the mass, or to use Evan Burke's phrase, the swinish multitude, are being allowed too much control and influence. So what you see with postmodern conservatives is this argument that we need to recapture the state, or we need to recapture and reconceive of international institutions to ensure that culturally liberal and leftist movements aren't able to use these kinds of institutions and the kind of heft that comes with them in order to put these unworthy groups in their place. And we can also use them, of course, to re-solidify and recalcify our power. And I think it's important to take note of this because sometimes people misconstrue postmodern conservatism and right-wing populism as having a kind of weirdly radical edge to it. They'll say things like, well, these don't seem very much like conservative movements, since a lot of them talk about the people against the elites or the people against academics or intellectuals or whatever it happens to be. How can these be conservative movements if these are the kind of groups that they're agitating against? But it's really important to understand that what distinguishes right-wing populism from, for instance, left-wing populism, if you think of something like AMLO in Mexico, or Morales in Bolivia, or even Bernie Sanders in the United States, is left-wing populism tends to be anti-elitist, and it takes this position that the people need to fight against the elites, but the rhetoric and the kind of outlook it almost takes is inclusive. So there's this demand by people like Morales, by people like AMLO, by people like Sanders, to say these groups have always been historically excluded from society, the poor, people of color, indigenous groups, and they now need to be included because they occupy a more authentic or a more kind of real status than institutions are currently recognizing. And so what we need to do is have a movement that's going to corrode historical power structures in order to create a more kind of egalitarian society, at least in principle, right? What defines right-wing populism is that it's not about inclusion in this way, right? Right-wing populism typically holds that once upon a time, there was a deserving people that were actually in charge, right? We're at the top of this hierarchy and kept the kind of groups that leftists and liberals are concerned to emancipate in their place. Since then, we've seen too much power shifting towards liberals and progressives who've been successful in kind of pushing these demands for inclusion. So what we need is a kind of sharp and visceral return to the way things were once upon a time in order to restore a sense of order, glory, and identity, and a sense of thick identity. So that's my presentation for you. Again, I tried to keep it relatively short and sweet because I think the most important things are taking questions. So that's what I'm happy to do right now if anyone wants to talk about something.
Thank you, Matthew. Such a very enlightenment and wonderful presentation you did. In terms of your presentation, I would love to ask, if you allow me, to only 3 or 4 questions. One from Imran's side. Yeah. One from Imran, one of the very brilliant minds of our state. One of the developed country as USA, where the modernization is at high rate, making it technically strong. As being a developed free-minded state, the discrimination on religion exists. And I think that the Muslims suffer the most because of the attacks like 9/11 and more. But did it right to discriminate the whole community for wrong by some, where the people lose their opportunity because of their religion? What about their sufferings?
No, I think that's wrong in almost every circumstance, right? And I didn't frame my presentation as a kind of commentary on multiculturalism and its possibilities in other contexts, in no small part because that's separate discussion, right? And I think it's important to note that there are various different models that state institutions can take when it comes to civic inclusion on the part of religious minorities, right? And we can talk about gradations of toleration and inclusion, right? So for instance, Canada takes an extremely multicultural approach to religious inclusion, arguing that we need to look at the different cultures that make up the Canadian state as more or less equal, right? And in the event that there are inequalities that exist between them, it's important for the state to actually intervene to try to rectify that, right? So it's a very inclusive kind of approach, at least in principle, right, to inclusion of on the part of religious minorities. But you can also look at other countries, like, for instance, France, what's the other one? Or Tunisia, sorry, contemporaneously. They take what's sometimes called an intercultural approach, which is that there will be a dominant religious faith, right? Israel is also the same way, I should say, right? Its views will be the ones that are expounded by state officials. However, there will be substantial protections in place, including legal protections that will allow religious minorities to continue practicing their faith. They won't be able to organize politically or demand state restitution for inequalities, except in very extreme cases, right? Now, at the other end of the spectrum, you have theocratic regimes, like what you see, for instance, in Iran or Saudi Arabia, where there are extremely discriminatory policies against religious minorities who may at the very best be tolerated, but certainly are granted almost no kind of protections and are often subject to very, very considerable forms of abuse and persecution, right? And one of the things that I get concerned about when I think about India, for example, is India, of course, once aspired towards a much more multicultural or at least intercultural approach to the management of religious difference, but with the emergence of the BJP hegemony in the 2010s and the rise of Modi, it's moving much more in a kind of, not quite a theocratic, but more of an integralist direction is the way I would describe it, right? And I think this is a very bad thing, because I do think that people have a fundamental right to practice and hold to their religious convictions insofar as they don't try to impose them through force on others, right? And I think this is actually extremely important, because if you think about how important, how essential religious identity is to our sense of of who we are and what's of transcendent value, preventing someone from practicing their religious beliefs is an extremely prejudicial way of essentially condemning them and who they are and what their community stands for. Right.
Thank you so much. I will add some more value information to you. Our Facebook users have been asking so many questions for you, Matthew, but I don't have so much time, and I know you are a busy man. Then I will pick some very important questions from their side. Rudranan asking, how do you explain existence of new liberal society and postmodern culture?
Oh, so neoliberalism and postmodern conservatism, is that the idea?
Yeah.
Okay.
He's asking about.
Good. So there's a lot of debate about what constitutes neoliberalism, right? Almost everyone agrees that it's a kind of economic governance or logic of economic governance. But what exactly it entails, a matter subject to substantial debate. It's worth noting the term itself was coined in the 1950s, I believe, by Milton Friedman, who wrote an essay talking about who are the neoliberals. But for a long time, it was then eschewed by people who actually held to what we would now call neoliberal convictions, who preferred to define themselves as classical liberals, right? And then it was only actually after the Great Recession that the term started to come back in vogue, and you saw institutions like the IMF and the World Trade Organization start to overtly describe themselves as neoliberal institutions, okay? But what defines neoliberalism is this disposition to regard the market as the primary form of human life, right? It's the primary way that we interact with one another. And consequently, to regard the market as the primary way for framing how we understand people, right? People should be fundamentally understood as entrepreneurs who mobilize their capital, including their social and human capital, right? In order to pursue their self-interest, okay? And one of the things that's distinctive about neoliberalism was this idea that if people actually don't think of themselves that way, they think of themselves as, for instance, part of a democratic or a religious or a national community first and foremost, then government institutions or even international law need to step in to try to compel them to act in this kind of way, because that would be beneficent over the long run, right? So for instance, what you saw throughout the 1980s with neoliberal internationalism was this real effort, usually guided by American power, to reconstitute many developing countries along neoliberal lines, often in the face of substantial democratic opposition, and often in the face of substantial opposition by marginalized, particularly indigenous groups, right? You'd say that we don't conceive of ourselves first and foremost along market lines. We tend to prioritize other things. And for instance, institutions like the IMF would tie access to money and loans to the implementation of what they then called structural adjustment programs, what we would now call fiscal austerity programs, in order to receive these monies. And there were also, substantial pressures being imposed by the United States, both culturally and sometimes even militarily, to accept these kinds of loans and the changes that would be associated with them. So the way this is associated with postmodernity is once you start to try to compel people to conceive of themselves primarily on market lines, it's important to recognize that there are certain definitive features to the market that are very amenable to the postmodern corrosion of the self, right? Because if you think about how it is that we conceive of, how it is that most people think of who they are, right? They tend to ask themselves, well, what do I believe, right? What are the values that I hold to? What is enduringly true about, value in human life, right? And one of the things that's characteristic about market society is there's nothing that's of enduring and eternal value in human life, right? Everything is contingent, all values are contingent upon what people are willing to pay to realize those values, right? Everything has its price, is the way that it's sometimes defined. And when people start to appreciate value this way, right, in terms of price, in terms of self-gratification, in terms of relative value compared to other things, as determined by the logic of the market, then it's a very, very easy step to start thinking about things relativistically, right? And I think what we've seen with a lot of people right now is they tend to approach things like the question of moral or religious values like consumers, right? They say, well, you have your value system, I have my value system. This is the one that works for me. You should choose the one that works for you, which is very much the same approach to conceiving of moral values as someone takes to questions of fashion, for example, right? Do you want to buy this coat or do you want to buy that coat? Doesn't really matter. Everyone has their opinion. You choose the one that works best for you, right? So that's just one example of how the implementation of these kind of neoliberal reforms and the extension of this way of thinking about things in market terms contributed to the emergence of something like postmodernism, particularly with regard to the relativization of our sense of what's of enduring moral value in the world.
Thank you, Madhu, for such a very wonderful answer given by you. Last few years, you're working on marginal and community, right? I would love to ask, I would ask to love, what is your sense related to this jargonical world? One is called developed nation and another is undeveloped, right? And people are saying we are developing. I don't know what kind of we are going to developing in coming last 7 decades, right? Then what is your ideas on Habermas? He always said the content and the community always stuck together in terms of their sense of liberalism, right? And then if you look, you are quite intelligent. What I feel personally, you asked in your first slide, what is postmodernism, right? Postmodernism, nothing. It's a new idea of historical bias about political philosophy and economic liberalism. It's a bridge between the new to old, right? And this postmodernism authority is always lacking behind all this jargonical word, impose us in terms of how to sell their ideas and their consumerization all products in terms of third world countries. And they are impose their ideas on us. What your ideas on this particular topic, Matthew?
Yeah, I think there's no denying that, right? I mean, if you think about the concept of modernity, right? The concept of modernity was very much developed in a Western European and then later American context. And it was associated usually with the spread of Enlightenment value systems, right? Liberalism, freedom for all, equality for all. But it was also very much associated with the spread of markets, right? And the logic of markets, it's in many parts of the world. Now, it's important to note that in the 19th century, there was also a shift since with the rise of socialist movements and Marxism, right? These kinds of movements started to say, we are also oriented around this ideal of achieving modernization for much of the rest of the world, except we believe that the kind of standard bearer of modernization will be socialism and not capitalism. And that's very important when you think about, say, an Indian context, with things like the Congress Party and Nehru's kind of early flirtation with a kind of nationalist, not quite socialist, but definitely socialist light kind of approach to development, right? But either way, whether you talk about socialist modernization or capitalist modernization, the idea was spread Enlightenment values, spread the right economic system to the world, to the right parts of the world, and things will get better, right? And I don't think that this is entirely a misguided outlook, right? There are many things that are beneficial about modernization, like when it comes to things like economic development and the kind of increasing sophistication of the means of production in many parts of the world. I think what was problematic about modernization was to this day, was the supposition that this should be carried out through various forms of imperialism as an imposition on the part of Western states, where they went into these countries and said, whether you like it or not, this is what we're going to be bringing you, right? I think that, what we started to see with the emergence of anti-colonial movements in the early 20th century, by people like Nehru and Gandhi, for example, but also people like the Institutional Revolutionary Party in Mexico, was we want to implement modernization in our countries, at least aspects of modernization, but we want to do so without the presence of hegemonic authority and other forms of state power telling us how to carry out these projects, right? That need to be determined at the nation state level by the people who are going to be impacted them, because we have our own respective cultural traditions and expectations and practices that we want to preserve or that we want to actually revivify if you happen to be a colonial state that was being oppressed by a Western imperialist, right? So what you've really seen since the 1950s is this very complex debate surrounding modernization, where many post-colonial and anti-colonial theorists will say there are elements of modernization as it was historically understood that are important and that need to be implemented in the rest of the world, the post-colonial world. But there are other elements of modernization, particularly its association with Western and now American imperialism, that need to be utterly rejected. And how to disconnect the two is a very difficult intellectual and also political project, right? When it comes to this kind of discourse about postmodernism and postmodernization, again, the way that I tend to describe it is once you see certain elements of modernity become firmly implemented in various different countries, and in many cases, they've been implemented through quasi-imperialist neoliberal regimes of governments, right? If you think about, again, the implementation of these kind of anti-austerity or structural adjustment programs by neoliberal institutions like the International Monetary Fund or the World Trade Organization, backed by American power. But once you kind of see these implemented, you're going to start to see the processes of dissolving sources of selfhood that I described and the emergence of various kinds of postmodern attitudes and dispositions, right? Now, this isn't a causal claim because it's not true everywhere, but it's a general tendency I think you can see in many countries. And the response to this kind of dissolution of sources of the self brought about in part by neoliberalization, but there are other factors as well, right? The decline of traditional religious values, I think, is also extraordinarily important, and I didn't even discuss it. But you start to see this reaction against that on the part of these postmodern conservative movements, all of which take very different forms in many different countries, right? And that's one of the things that I stress in the book. It's important to understand that conservatism historically has looked different everywhere that it appears. German conservatism is different than English conservatism, which is different than Indian conservatism, right? And postmodern conservatism also looks substantially different everywhere that it appears, right? And there are a lot of reasons for that, but this has already been a long answer, so I'll just move on to the next question.
Thank you so much. And you are sitting in the best side of the globe, and we are sitting in the rest side of the globe, if I'm not wrong. Mm-hmm. And you are representing the oldest democracy of the globe, and we are the largest democracy of the world. Mm-hmm. Then tell me, how could the Chinese people take over the entire arena of this pandemic world? And what is your ideas on particular WTO, World Trade Organization, and WHO, World Health Organization, and IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and UNDP, and lastly, World Bank is concerned? What is your ideas about these world and globe organizations? How could they sell their ideas in terms of this pandemic and gift of this LPG is concerned? How could you see and narrate your own capacity of understanding in terms of these redefine, define, or undefined kind of things?
Okay, well, that's a very good question. Okay, and I want to point out that I'm by no means uncritical of international institutions, whether we're talking about the World Health Organization or certainly neoliberal institutions like the IMF or the WTO. If anything, I would be very happy to see at least a few of these disappear, right? But what I'd argue is that all the kinds of postmodern conservatism that we've seen have had a kind of anti-cosmopolitan quality to them. And there are a lot of reasons to this, but one of the biggest reasons is the sense that cosmopolitan institutions are associated with liberal values broadly, right? Not neoliberal values, but liberal values in the sense of inclusion, toleration, a certain degree of cultural permissiveness. And this is rightly or wrongly, right? Because a lot of these institutions, I don't think are committed to this, but they're associated with it by these postmodern conservative movements. And consequently, there's been a very visceral response to them, right? And an argument that power needs to be restored either to the nation state level or in darker cases, to the level of the national ethnic group or the national religious group that once upon a time was in a position of dominance, but that has been corroded in part through the efforts of these cosmopolitan institutions to kind of take power away from them and situate it at the international level, right? And so when the COVID-19 pandemic broke out in 2020, right, which I was living in Mexico at the time, it was really quite shocking, right, how quickly everything closed up. We were a developing country, and things move a little bit slowly, but even within the course of like 1 or 2 weeks, like everything was just fucking closed, right? And the response by a lot of these postmodern conservative movements was to see this as an effort by the part of these kind of cosmopolitan elites and associated institutions to once again seize power from the nation state level and undermine these movements indirectly by suggesting that people need to band together, that there needed to be an international approach to managing this, and also that the state needed to play a role. And this is important in distinguishing why these are conservative movements, right? Because with the rise of COVID, we saw this real push on the part of the state, on the part of civil society groups to demand that the state redistribute high levels of wealth in order to keep the population more or less alive throughout the pandemic, since so many people weren't able to go to work, right? So you have kind of a perfect storm for many of these postmodern conservative movements, where not only are international cosmopolitans saying we need to cooperate together and power needs to be ceded to the international level in order to manage the pandemic, but you also see domestic political groups, particularly liberal and leftist groups, saying, in addition to that, we need to actually redistribute money from elites down to working groups in society in order to take care of everyone while they don't go to work. Well, that's a lethal combination for these movements, and they reacted very viscerally against it, right? If you think about the kind of efforts to resist all elements of this program by people like Donald Trump, by a lot of the conservative movements here in Canada, by Jair Bolsonaro, probably most spectacularly in Brazil, and the consequences were pretty predictable, right? Or Modi in India, I should say also, right? Although that was, again, a different case, since this had more to do in many cases with religious reasons and a lack of supply, vaccine supplies and oxygen supplies. But, a lot of these conservative movements, as a consequence, saw huge increases in the number, in the rates of COVID infections, right? And this gradually started to undermine their credibility, even in the mind of their supporters, right? So one of the kind of effects of the COVID-19 pandemic has been a gradual corrosion of support for many of these conservative movements around the globe, who are widely seen as having mismanaged the crisis and putting their own political agendas ahead of things like just sensible, scientifically driven policies for the management of disease, right? Now, whether this means we reach a tipping point where a lot of these movements are going to disappear, I don't know, right? Donald Trump probably lost the election in the United States because he mishandled COVID. In fact, not probably, he certainly did, right? That played a huge role in it. You've seen support for people like Bolsonaro declining pretty rapidly, right? And support for the Workers' Party, led by Lula, kind of resurge, right? But whether this is going to initiate a global trend, I don't know. We'll have to see, right?
Thank you. Do you agree this is the time movements should be globalized? What is your views on it?
Do I think that I do think that there should be global movements. Absolutely, right? I mean, one of the things that I would say is that if we're trying to think about how it is that international cosmopolitan movements can be reconceived, I actually have a book coming out on this in a few months. One of the reasons why cosmopolitan movements were rightly criticized in some circumstances, not just by postmodern conservatives, but even by some leftists and liberals, was many of these institutions were fundamentally were not democratic. They were responsive to the interests of elites in Western countries, and many of them also operated primarily at the discretion of the U.S., of the American state, right, and served to kind of reinforce American hegemony in many parts of the globe. And it should come as no surprise that if you have international institutions that are oriented in this way, people are going to respond pretty hot with a great deal of hostility towards them, right? So I think if we're going to talk about rejuvenating a kind of cosmopolitan outlook, one of the steps to take, and you mentioned Habermas before, he makes this kind of argument, is by creating democratic support for cosmopolitan institutions on the ground. And the only way to do that is to allow people to have more on a say in how it is that these institutions operate and the kind of priorities they're going to pursue, right? I think this is extremely important if you think about the European Union, especially, which is probably the most developed international institution in the globe. One of the reasons we see things like Brexit or these kinds of nationalist movements in Italy and Hungary is this sense that Brussels is really removed from the concerns of ordinary people on the ground. And people are not wrong about that, right? So the way to kind of rejuvenate that project is, of course, to try to build support for it on the ground by making people feel that the EU is accountable. I think something very similar can be said for the United Nations, right? Which for a long time has been very much an elite, technocratically driven project that very few people have much of an understanding of what it is that it does. And I think that needs to be changed pretty fundamentally, although that will be a much longer term process since the structure of the United Nations and its level of support around the globe varies a lot more than what you see at the European Union, right? Nonetheless, it's a project that we need to undertake. And it's going to be a very long-term one. If you actually are somebody like me who's committed to a version of the cosmopolitan project, at least one that's anti-imperialist, democratic, but still kind of universalist in its outlook.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I will end here by asking last question from your side. If progress is seen as a kind of trap of ourselves, has this any relation to the modern contradiction or condition? What have the modernists said?
Yeah, okay, that's a great question, right? And I think one of the emblematic features about the discourse around modernity, and this is true both of capitalist discourses around modernity and socialist discourses around modernity, particularly socialist discourses around modernity, was this idea that progress was inevitable, right? Enlightenment capitalist liberals said, if you spread markets and you spread a kind of liberal outlook to places, improvements are going to emerge quite rapidly, right? Many socialists, drawing upon kind of vulgar versions of Marxist theory, said something very similar, right? What the dialectic of history is moving in a certain direction. Communism and socialism are inevitable once we get through necessary stages in the kind of pre-history of humankind. And when these societies inevitably emerge, they're going to be the best possible society that we can have, right? I think it's very clear, looking back from a 21st century vantage point, that these discourses of inevitable progress or inexorable progress were pretty fantastic and often almost had a kind of religious quality to them. And I mean that in the bad sense, not, the more general sense of religious. There was a millenarian faith that progress was going to come one way or another. I think we've seen in the 21st century is that progress, however you define that, is something you need to work for consistently. And it's a project that you need to build support for on the ground constantly. And we should by no means take it for granted that progress is just going to move unilaterally in one direction. There'll be setbacks, there'll be reactionary movements that try to push against progressive kinds of politics. And sometimes they can be very successful at that. And so we need to be smarter in combating them. How we can go about doing this, I think, varies very much depending on the country. How to initiate progressive reform in India is going to look extremely different than how it is that we can try to achieve progressive reforms in, say, Canada, where I am right now. I'm volunteering for the New Democratic Party. We have our kind of ways of trying to push Canada in a more progressive direction. It's very different than what you'd see in the United States or elsewhere, right? So that's the kind of answer that I'd give for you, right? Drop the idea that progress is inexorable. Grant the idea that modernization means one thing or another, and it's coming whether reactionaries want it or not, and try to build support for your vision of progressive politics in your country, and make sure that you be very sensitive to how it is that the people who are actually going to be impacted by these policies perceive it.
Thank you so much, Matthew, for responding all the questions in a very fantastic manner. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Professor Dr. Jana, can you go for formal vote of thanks?
Yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Matthews, for a wonderful talk. I am just going through your book that called the preview of what is postmodern conservatism, essays on our hugely tremendous times. And you are very wonderfully explain your ideas about modern conservatism, postmodern conservatism. You are raising the questions, the fundamental questions of our time is whether the West has the will to survive. Do we have the confidence in our values to defend them at any cost? Do we have enough respect for our citizens to protect borders? So you are raising very important questions and addressing very important global issues, and our audiences are quite happy to be in conversation and with your talk. Thank you so much for joining us to the World Human Sciences and Management Conference. I would like to thank our coordinating institutions, IIM Sambalpur and Central University of Odisha. And also would like to thank Dr. Chandi Prasad Nanda and Dr. Sarat Palito and the entire man behind this program, the director of Center for ADIVASI Research and Development, Dr. Vikram Jena, and our entire team, Subham Das, Dr. Samuel Lima, Dr. Kamal Prasad, and Dr. Nupur Patnaik for helping us. And most of all, I would like to thank the social media audiences from YouTube and Facebook, and the audiences, a few audiences here. And we have with us, the General Secretary of Odisha History Congress, Professor Subhash Barik. Thank you, sir, for joining us. And now we are going to conclude the meeting. Thank you, Professor Matthews, for joining with us and share your valuable thoughts and ideas and your feelings. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope you are all well and stay safe during the middle of the pandemic. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir.